Some fathers protect their daughters. Edmund Hawthorne sold his. In front of 100 laughing strangers, at a frontier auction where horses and plows traded hands, a 24-year-old woman named Abigail Hawthorne stood on a wooden platform while her own father counted coins. The crowd thought it was funny. The auctioneer thought it was business. And Abigail, humiliated, shaking, staring at a sky that offered nothing, made herself one promise: never again. Never again would she trust a man with her dignity, her future, or her life. She had no idea that by nightfall, everything she believed about that promise would be tested. If this story already has your attention, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning of the Millhaven Frontier Fair started the way most bad days did in the Montana Territory. Quietly, with the kind of pale gray sky that promised nothing good. Abigail Hawthorne was awake before dawn. She always was. Sleep had never come easy to her, not in that house, not under that roof, and especially not when she could hear her father moving around downstairs with the particular kind of purpose that made her stomach go tight. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the creak of floorboards, the clink of a glass bottle, the low muttering that Edmund Hawthorne reserved for conversations he was having with himself, or with whatever version of his dead wife he kept in his head after too much whiskey. She got up, washed her face from the basin, put on her second-best dress because her best one had a tear in the hem she hadn't finished mending, and she'd learned years ago that appearing in public in anything less than decent invited comment from the people of Millhaven, who needed very little invitation as it was. She came downstairs to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with his hat already on, which was unusual. Edmund didn't wear his hat indoors unless he was going somewhere he considered important. "You're up early," she said. "So are you." He didn't look at her. He was studying something on the table. A piece of paper, folded in thirds, the kind that came from the county office. "Get yourself some breakfast. We're leaving at 7. "Leaving for where?" "The fair." Abigail studied the back of his head, the thin gray hair, the reddened neck above his collar. Her father was 53 years old and looked 70. Drink and bitterness had done that to him, carved him down from the broad-shouldered man in the one photograph she'd seen of him young, reduced him to something smaller and meaner than he'd started out as. "I wasn't planning on going to the fair," she said. "You're going." She wanted to argue. She almost did. But she'd been having that same argument in various forms for 24 years, and she knew how it ended. So she cut 2 slices of bread, ate them standing at the counter, and went to get her coat. The Millhaven Frontier Fair happened every September in the wide flat field behind the feed store, and it drew people from a 30-mile radius: ranchers, farmers, tradespeople, the occasional circuit preacher, and the usual assortment of folks who just wanted a reason to leave home for a day. There were livestock pens along the east fence, equipment displays on the west, food tables in the center, and at the far north end, elevated on a rough wooden platform, the auction block. They auctioned a lot of things at the Millhaven Fair: horses, cattle, farming equipment, unclaimed goods from estates, the occasional piece of land when the owner had died or gone under. It was the kind of auction that drew serious bidders and serious money, and the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Clyde Birch who wore the same red vest every year, ran it with a performance energy that the crowd seemed to enjoy. Abigail had been to the fair before. She didn't enjoy it. The fair meant standing in public while the women of Millhaven made assessments they thought were subtle and weren't, and the men either ignored her or spoke to her with a particular brand of condescending kindness that felt worse than being ignored. She was, by the town's consistent and openly stated consensus, too much, too big, too wide, too present, too aware of her own mind in a way that made people uncomfortable. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's black hair, and absolutely none of the small, neat proportions that the women around her seemed to have been issued at birth. She'd stopped being wounded by the comments sometime around age 16, or she'd told herself she had. The truth was more complicated than that, but she didn't spend much time examining it. She followed her father through the crowd, keeping pace with his long, unhurried strides, and noticed after a few minutes that he wasn't stopping at any of the displays, wasn't looking at the livestock, wasn't greeting any of the men he knew, which was unusual because Edmund Hawthorne liked to be seen at public events, liked to shake hands and be known. He was walking straight toward the auction platform. "Papa," she caught his sleeve. "What are we doing over here?" "Business," he said, and kept walking. She let go of his sleeve, followed him because she didn't know what else to do. Clyde Birch spotted Edmund and gave him a nod that Abigail didn't understand. A quick, professional nod, the kind exchanged between two people who have already made arrangements. Her stomach tightened again. Harder this time. "Papa?" Her voice came out lower than she meant it to. "What kind of business?" Edmund turned and looked at her then. Really looked at her. And the expression on his face was the one she'd been seeing her whole life and had never quite been able to name. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more tired than that. Something that had already made its decision and was just waiting for the moment to act on it. "You're a burden I can't carry anymore," he said. "The drought took the South Field. The banknote comes due in October. I've got nothing left to negotiate with except what I've got." The words landed one at a time, slow and separate, like stones dropped into still water. "What you've got," she repeated. "Your guardianship papers," he said. "A man has the legal right to transfer guardianship of an unmarried daughter. It's been done before. It's legal." The world went a little sideways. She was aware of people nearby, aware of the sounds of the fair continuing around them. A child laughing somewhere, a horse protesting in one of the pens, the general hum of several hundred people going about a normal September morning. "You're going to auction me," she said. "I'm transferring your guardianship to a man who can provide for you. It's practical." "It's selling me." "It's the law," Edmund said, and his voice had the particular flatness it got when he was done being reasoned with. "It's been arranged. Mr. Birch has handled the paperwork. Now stop making a scene." Not that she didn't run. She thought about it. Her legs actually tensed with the impulse, and for one clear second she could see herself pushing through the crowd, getting to the edge of the field, making it to the road. But where would she go? She had $4 in her skirt pocket. She knew no one outside of Millhaven. She had no horse, no traveling clothes, no plan. So she stood there. She stood there while Clyde Birch climbed up to his platform and announced with a jovial energy that made her want to be sick that the next item up was a special one. "Folks, something a little different. A chance for the right kind of man to acquire responsibility for a hardworking young woman. Full legal guardianship transfer, all papers in order." She stood there while the crowd turned to look at her, and she watched the expressions ripple across their faces. Surprise, amusement, speculation, that particular look that people get when something uncomfortable is happening, and they've decided to treat it as entertainment. She climbed the 3 wooden steps to the platform because Clyde Birch gestured for her to, and because her body was operating on a kind of autopilot that was separate from whatever was happening inside her chest. The platform put her above the crowd. She could see all of them clearly from up there. The familiar faces of Millhaven, the visiting ranchers she didn't know, the women near the food tables who had stopped what they were doing to watch. "Now there she is," Clyde announced, turning to the crowd with his red vest and his auctioneer's smile. "Miss Abigail Hawthorne, 24 years of age, healthy and able-bodied." Someone in the crowd laughed. It spread. Not everyone, not even most of them, but enough. A ripple of laughter, low and unkind, the kind that has a specific target and knows it. Abigail had spent her whole life building a wall between herself and that sound. She thought the wall was solid by now. She thought she'd reinforced it enough times that nothing could get through. She'd been wrong about that. The laughter got in. It got in through every crack she'd ever tried to patch, and it was worse than the single meanest thing anyone had ever said to her because it wasn't one person. It was a crowd. It was public. It was her entire world bearing witness and finding the situation funny. Finding her funny. Finding her humiliation something to be enjoyed on a September morning at the fair. She kept her chin up. She didn't know why. Some stubborn thing in her spine that refused to bend even when everything else wanted to. She stood on that platform with her hands at her sides and her jaw set, and she looked out over the crowd, and she did not cry, and she made herself one promise. Never again. Never again would she put herself in a position where a man held this kind of power over her future. Never again would she trust, defer, hope, believe. She was done. The bidding started at $6. She knew this because Clyde Birch announced it, and because she heard the number with a kind of detached disbelief. $6, do I have 6? That made the laughter worse because now it had a price attached to it. She cataloged the bidders without looking directly at any of them. An older man near the front with a thick gray beard, She knew him vaguely, knew he had a place south of town and a reputation for being difficult. A younger man she didn't recognize, maybe 30, with an eager quality to him that made her skin crawl. Two others she couldn't see clearly. The bidding went up in increments. $8, $11, $14. She tracked it the way she'd track anything happening to someone else, something removed and theoretical, and kept her eyes on the middle distance and kept her chin up and kept breathing. $15. The gray-bearded man. Clyde asked for 16. Silence. 15 going once. $15. Her father's voice somewhere below her. I get $15 for this. The laughter again. Louder now. She heard someone say something that included the word mule and a burst of answering laughter, and she understood she had just been explicitly compared to livestock and found less valuable. 15 going twice. 22. The voice came from the back of the crowd. New voice. Male. Not loud, but carrying. The kind of voice that didn't have to work to be heard because there was something in the quality of it that made people listen. The crowd shifted. Heads turned. Clyde Birch squinted toward the back of the assembled bidders and said, 22? Got 22. Do I have 23? Silence. 22 going once. 22 going twice. Clyde paused for effect. Sold. To the gentleman in the back. Abigail looked toward the back of the crowd. She could see a man making his way forward through the press of people. Tall, dark-coated, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who wasn't accustomed to being rushed. She caught a brief impression of a jaw set hard under a dark hat brim, broad shoulders, work-worn hands. Then her father was beside her, helping her down from the platform with a hand she didn't want and couldn't refuse without making another scene. And she heard him saying something about the transfer papers, and she was moving through the crowd while people watched her go with the satisfied expressions of people who'd gotten good entertainment for their morning. She didn't look at any of them. The man who had bought her was named Gideon Mercer. She learned this 20 minutes later, standing in the narrow space between the back of the livestock pens and the fence line, where Clyde Birch had apparently arranged for the paperwork transfer to take place. Gideon Mercer stood across from her father, reading the guardianship document with the focused attention of a man who read things before he signed them, which already put him ahead of most of the men she'd known. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. Hard to be more precise than that because the territory had a way of aging people. Sun and wind and physical work carved lines into faces faster than years did. He was lean without being thin, the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than intention. His coat was good quality, but had been mended at the left cuff. His boots were worn at the heel. There was a scar along his left jaw that she catalogued and filed without meaning to. He hadn't looked at her yet. He was still reading the document. There's a clause here about medical responsibility, he said to Clyde Birch. Does this obligate me for prior debts? No, sir, just going forward. And this language about domestic arrangements. What does that mean exactly? Clyde Birch shifted. Well, it's standard language. I didn't ask if it was standard. I asked what it means. Birch cleared his throat. It means the guardian can determine where the ward resides and what her household responsibilities are. Gideon Mercer looked up from the document for the first time. He looked at Abigail. It was a brief look, quick, assessing, entirely without the particular quality she'd been bracing for. Not the leer she'd expected, not the satisfied appraisal of a man examining a purchase. More like someone taking inventory of a situation they were trying to understand. Can she speak for herself? He asked, still talking to Birch. Abigail answered before Birch could. Yes, she said. She can. Mercer's attention shifted back to her. He had dark eyes, brown or very dark gray, hard to tell in the afternoon light. They had lines at the corners that hadn't come from smiling. Are you hurt? He asked. The question caught her completely off guard. What? Are you hurt? The auction. Are you injured? I'm not physically injured, no, she said, and couldn't keep the edge out of her voice entirely. Something moved across his face. Not quite an expression, more like the recognition of one. He nodded and looked back down at the document. I'm not signing this, he said. Her father made a sharp sound. The bid was accepted. I know. I'm not disputing the bid. I'm not signing this. He held up the document. This language gives me authority over her residence, her employment, her marriage. I don't want that authority. I'll pay the $22. I'll pay it in exchange for something simpler, a written statement that she's free to go where she chooses and I have no claim over her. Edmund Hawthorne stared at him. That's not how this works. That's how I want it to work. Then what do you get for your $22? Mercer folded the document and held it back out to Birch. Peace of mind, he said, and a clean conscience. There was a long pause. Abigail stood very still and tried to understand what was happening, which was difficult because nothing about it fit any pattern she'd learned to recognize. Her father, in the end, argued for another 10 minutes about legal standing, about the proper execution of a valid transaction, about what was and wasn't proper, and Gideon Mercer listened to all of it without visible impatience and without changing his position. Finally, Clyde Birch drafted a simpler document, 3 sentences basically, confirming payment and releasing her from her father's guardianship with no transfer of authority to anyone. Edmund signed it with the expression of a man completing an unpleasant task. He took the $22 without looking at Abigail. He walked away without a word to her. She watched him go, watched until she couldn't see him anymore in the crowd, and then kept watching the empty space where he'd been for a moment longer. Miss Hawthorne, she turned. Mercer was watching her with the same careful, unreadable expression. I have a ranch about 8 miles north, he said. It's not much, but it's got a spare room and I can offer you a job. Bookkeeping mostly. I'm not good with numbers and the finances are a mess. You'd be paid for your work. He paused. You don't have to come. You can take the next stage out of Millhaven. Go wherever you're going. That's your choice to make. She studied him. She'd had years of practice reading men, cataloging the small signs, the minute tells, the difference between what they said and what they wanted. She looked for them now and found herself genuinely uncertain. Why did you bid on me? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I got there late, he said, and I saw who else was bidding. She waited for more. He didn't offer any. That's it? She said. That's most of it. She thought about the $4 in her skirt pocket. She thought about the stage schedule. There was a westbound stage on Thursdays, and today was Tuesday. She thought about the fact that she had nowhere to go and no one waiting for her anywhere on earth. She also thought about the gray-bearded man who'd been bidding against him, about the younger man with the eager qualities she hadn't liked. 8 miles north, she said, give or take. What does the bookkeeping pay? $12 a month, plus room and board. It was a fair wage. Better than fair, actually. Better than most of what a woman in her position could expect. She didn't know if that meant he was generous or if the books were so badly kept that he was desperate. I'll need to see the situation before I commit, she said. That's reasonable. And I have conditions. Something in his face shifted slightly. All right. I do the work I agree to do and you don't interfere. I live in the spare room and it stays my space. And if I want to leave, for any reason, at any time, I leave. No questions, no argument, no papers to sign. He held her gaze for a moment. Those are fair conditions, he said. I accept them. She picked up the small bag she'd been carrying. She hadn't known she was leaving today, hadn't known anything about today, but she traveled light out of habit, and said, Then let's see this ranch. The drive north took just over an hour by wagon. They didn't talk much. Abigail spent most of it looking at the land. The Montana Territory did this to her sometimes. It was so large that it had a kind of quieting effect, like whatever was happening inside her was too small to sustain itself against that much sky. The grass had gone gold in September, the hills rolling and broad, the mountains to the west holding a line of snow along their ridges that would work its way down over the next few months until it reached the valley floor. It was beautiful country. She'd always thought so, even when the town in it was terrible. Cattle operation? She asked, about halfway there. Mostly, Mercer said. Some horses. I've got 40 head of cattle right now, which is about half what I should have for a ranch this size. What happened to the other half? A pause. That's part of what I need to figure out. She looked at him. He was watching the road, hands easy on the reins, but there was something tightened in his jaw. You think someone took them? I think the numbers don't add up and I can't find the gap, he said, which is why I need someone who can read a ledger and tell me what I'm missing. How long has this been going on? Maybe 2 years, maybe longer. I don't know. I can't read the books well enough to tell. She looked forward again. 2 years. If someone had been stealing from this man for 2 years, there would be a lot to untangle. The thought had a particular quality to it. Not excitement exactly, but something adjacent. The feeling of a problem she could sink her teeth into. "I'll look at the books," she said. "I know, that's why you're here." The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and her first thought was that struggling had been a generous word for it. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories, probably 15 years old, built by someone who'd had intentions of adding to it and hadn't gotten around to it yet. But the barn needed paint and had a section of roof that was visibly sagging. 2 of the fence posts along the western approach were leaning. The wagon path was rutted badly and hadn't been graded in probably 2 seasons. But the land itself, the land was good. She could see that even from the road. The grass was healthy despite the drought, which meant the water situation was better than average, probably a good underground source. The foothills to the north would provide wind protection in winter. The pasture acreage was generous. Someone with more resources could do a lot with this land. "How many hands?" she asked. "2 right now. Had 3, but 1 left in July." "Pete Calloway. He's been with me longest, handles the cattle. Young fella named Charlie Dow. He's good but green. And you. And me." She did a quick mental calculation. 3 men, 40 cattle, declining infrastructure, books that didn't balance. It was a picture she could read clearly, and what it told her was that this operation was bleeding money from somewhere, and had been for long enough that stopping the bleeding might not be sufficient. They might also need to address what had already been lost. She kept that assessment to herself for now. She'd read the actual books before she said anything. Pete Calloway was waiting near the barn when they pulled in. He was 60 or thereabouts, weathered as old leather, with a white mustache that he clearly took some care with. He looked at Abigail with the frank curiosity of a man who had not been expecting her. "Didn't know you were bringing company," he said to Mercer. "Last-minute arrangement. Pete, this is Abigail Hawthorne. She'll be doing the books and staying in the East Room." Pete's eyes moved to Abigail with an expression that wasn't quite readable. Not hostile. Not entirely welcoming either. The careful reserve of someone who'd learned to wait and see. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Mr. Calloway." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for Mercer to help her, not out of rudeness, just out of habit, and took a look at the barn up close. The roof sag was worse than it had appeared from the road. There was a line of discoloration on the east wall that suggested water had been getting in. "That roof," she said to no one in particular. "Been meaning to fix it," Pete said, with the tone of a man who has been meaning to do something for too long. "It'll take the whole structure down by spring if it's not reinforced before the snow," she said. "The weight distribution is already wrong. You can see it from the lean." Pete looked at her, then at Mercer, then back at her. "She's probably right," Mercer said. Charlie Dow showed up at dinner. A young man, maybe 20, with an open face and the energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to be tired. He stared at Abigail with undisguised surprise throughout most of the meal, which she ignored. Mercer had cooked. She hadn't expected that. Most men of her experience expected cooking to happen through some kind of domestic magic they didn't need to understand. The meal was simple but competent. Beans, salt pork, biscuits that were a little flat but edible. She ate at the same table as them. No one seemed to think this required commentary, which surprised her. "You're from Millhaven?" Charlie asked. "Born there." "How'd you end up—" He stopped, glanced at Mercer. "I needed work," Abigail said, which was true enough to serve as an answer. "I'll start on the books tomorrow." "They're in the study," Mercer said, "such as it is. More of a corner with a desk." "That's fine." After dinner, Mercer showed her to the East Room. It was small and plain, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out onto the east pasture. There was a hook on the back of the door and a braided rug on the floor that had seen better days. It was private. It had a door that closed. It was more space than she'd had in her father's house, where she'd slept in a room off the kitchen that didn't properly have a door at all, just a curtain. "It's fine," she said. Mercer stood in the doorway. "I want to say something," he said. She turned to look at him. "What happened today? At the auction?" He stopped. Seemed to be working out how to say what he meant. "That shouldn't have happened. Any of it. I'm not—" I want to be clear about what this is. You work here, I pay you. What you do outside of that is your own business. I'm not your guardian, and I don't intend to act like one." She held his gaze. "Why did you really bid?" she asked again. Again, the slight pause. "I know the men who were bidding before me," he said. "Danner, the older one with the beard. He's had 2 wives. Neither of them fared well." Something changed in the quality of his expression, briefly, quickly. "I got there late. I should have gotten there sooner." He said goodnight and pulled the door closed, and Abigail stood alone in the small, plain room listening to his footsteps recede down the hall, and she told herself very firmly that gratitude was not the same as trust, and that she had made a promise to herself this morning that she intended to keep. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since the auction platform, let herself feel everything she'd been holding back all day. The humiliation, the fury, the particular ache that came from her father's face as he walked away from her without looking back. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of it, counted them out in her head. Then she lay down, stared at the ceiling, and started planning how she was going to read those books in the morning. She started on the ledgers before breakfast. The desk in the corner of the main room was buried under a disorganized accumulation of papers, receipts, contracts, letters, what appeared to be a rough map of the property, and 6 ledger books of varying ages. She stacked everything into categories before she touched the numbers: active correspondence, completed transactions, pending matters, miscellaneous. It took an hour just to sort. Then she opened the oldest ledger. The books went back 7 years, to when Gideon Mercer had purchased the ranch. The earliest entries were relatively straightforward: purchase price, initial livestock costs, feed and supply expenses, a small amount of labor. The handwriting was careful in those early years, the numbers clear. Around year 3, things started getting complicated. She worked through it systematically, making her own notes, tracing the money forward and backward. Outside, she could hear the ranch coming alive, Pete's voice, the sound of horses, eventually the smell of coffee when someone finally got around to making it. Mercer appeared around 8 o'clock with 2 cups. He set one on the corner of the desk without asking if she wanted it, which she did, and looked at the spread of papers and notes around her. "You've been at it a while," he said. "These books are—" She stopped herself, started over. "You have an account with a grain supplier in Helena called Voss Agricultural." "That's right, Silas Voss. He's the biggest supplier in the territory. Most ranches in this valley work through him." "How long have you had that account?" "Since year 3. My original supplier closed up." "Did you negotiate the terms yourself?" "Voss sent a man out. We worked it out, and I signed the contract." She turned one of the ledgers so he could see it, pointing to a column of figures. "This is your feed account. You're being charged a base price of 12 cents per unit over the market rate." Mercer frowned at the numbers. "That can't be right. I've cross-referenced it against 3 different supply receipts and the published grain board prices for the past 4 years. You're paying 12 cents over, consistently, on every order." She turned to a different ledger. "Here's your herd insurance, taken out through a Voss affiliate company. The premium is standard, but the payout schedule has a clause that requires a 60-day waiting period and arbitration by—" She found the line. "A company representative, which means if you lose cattle, you can't get a timely payout without Voss's own people approving it." He was quiet. "There's more," she said. "Tell me. Your water rights agreement, do you have the original document?" He went to the filing cabinet in the corner. Not where it should have been, she noted, but where he'd apparently been keeping important documents, and riffled through it for a few minutes before pulling out a folded paper. He handed it to her. She read it twice, carefully. "This water rights agreement has an automatic renegotiation clause," she said, "every 3 years. But the renegotiation is triggered by the supplier, not by you, which means Voss controls when and whether you get to revisit the terms." She set the document down. "When did you last renegotiate?" "I haven't. I didn't know there was a clause." She looked at him. "Gideon." She'd used his first name without thinking about it and caught herself doing it too late to take it back. "Based on what I've read this morning, I think someone has been methodically building a structure around this ranch that's designed to restrict your options and drain your resources gradually. Not all at once, gradually. A few percentage points here, a clause there, a premium that's a little too high. Over 4 years, it adds up to, She checked her notes. Somewhere in the range of $800 to $1,000. Maybe more. I haven't gotten through all the books yet. The silence in the room had a weight to it. Voss, he said. It wasn't a question. Every single discrepancy traces back to him or to a company affiliated with him. Why? Mercer said. I'm one ranch. I don't have anything he needs. She looked back at the map she'd found earlier, picked it up. Does this show your full property boundary? That's the county survey map. She found what she was looking for and traced the line with her finger. This creek, the Harlow branch. It runs along your northern boundary. Right. Where does it go? He came closer to look. Stood near enough that she was aware of his presence, close but not crowded, which she registered as a deliberate thing. Comes off the mountain, runs through my north pasture, and then... He stopped. It feeds into the main valley water system, she said, which means whoever controls your northern boundary controls water access for everything downstream. She set the map down. How much land do you have between your current north fence and the mountain? About 60 acres of high pasture. Voss wants it, she said. I'd bet on it. He's not trying to put you out of business. He's trying to put you in a position where you have to sell. Too leveraged, too constrained, too thin on resources to survive a bad season. And then he comes in with an offer and your options are limited. Mercer was looking at the map. She couldn't read his expression clearly, but something in his posture had changed. There was a stillness to him that she hadn't seen before. The particular stillness of someone who has just had something confirmed that they suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. I met with Voss twice, he said. Once when we set up the account, once about 18 months ago. The second time he mentioned in passing that if I ever wanted to sell the north pasture, he'd be interested in discussing it. There it is, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. How long will it take you to go through all of it? A few more days. I want to make sure I've mapped the full picture before I say I'm certain. And when you are certain, she looked at the ledgers, at the carefully disguised, methodically constructed framework that someone had built around this ranch over 4 years, one contract clause, and one price adjustment at a time. At the elegant cruelty of it, not brutal enough to be obvious, just persistent enough to be fatal. Then we figure out what to do about it, she said. She'd been at the Mercer Ranch for 3 weeks when the first thing happened that she hadn't prepared for. She was fixing the fence along the west pasture. She'd found the tools and seen the leaning posts and decided that if she was going to document the financial deterioration of this operation, she might as well help stop the physical deterioration while she was at it, when she heard Pete Calloway come up behind her. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. It's not what you were hired for. The post is going to go through the first time a cow leans on it, she said. Hand me that mallet? He handed her the mallet, and then, to her mild surprise, he crouched down and held the post steady while she drove it. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Pete was methodical and competent, and he didn't talk unnecessarily, which she appreciated. Gideon told me some of what you found in the books, he said after a while. He told me he'd talk to you. Voss, Pete said the name flatly. I've never liked that man. There's something about him. He smiles too easy. You know the kind? I know the kind. Gideon's too honest, Pete said. It wasn't a criticism. He said it the way you'd describe a structural feature, something built into the architecture. He assumes other people are doing what they say they're doing. Always has. He paused. It's not a bad thing exactly, but it's the kind of thing that certain people notice and file away for use. She moved to the next post and checked the depth of the dig. How long have you been with him? Since the beginning. Came with the ranch, in a manner of speaking. I'd worked the land when the previous owner had it. Gideon kept me on. He picked up the wire stretcher. He's not what you might be expecting, he said carefully. She glanced at him. What would I be expecting? I don't know. Most women who've been through... He stopped. I shouldn't assume what you've been through. No, she agreed. You shouldn't. More silence. Comfortable, surprisingly. She was finding that Pete Calloway's silences had a quality that a lot of people's words didn't. He said things when he meant them and stopped when he didn't, and she respected that. The roof, she said. I want to take a look at the inside of the barn before I figure out what we need. I've got some boards put aside. Wasn't sure if there'd be money for the supplies we'd need beyond that. Let me see where we are in the finances first. Maybe there's more room than he thinks. Pete gave her a look that had something appreciative in it. All right, Miss Hawthorne. Abigail, she said. He seemed to consider this for a moment. All right, Abigail. Tits. She had her second unexpected moment later that week. She'd been working late in the study, long after Pete and Charlie had gone to their bunkhouse and the ranch had gone quiet. She was going through the final ledger, the most recent one, cross-referencing entries against the original contracts she'd found, building a complete picture she could put in front of someone with the authority to do something about it. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Mercer in the doorway with a plate. You missed dinner, he said. I know, I got caught up. He set the plate on the edge of the desk, cold beans and bread, but she was suddenly aware she hadn't eaten since noon. Find anything new? Maybe. She turned a page in the ledger. There's a series of entries from 8 months ago, cattle numbers. You had a full count in March. Then by June, you were short 14 head. The record shows them sold to a buyer at the fair. I know about that sale. Do you remember signing the bill of sale? He frowned. Birch handled it. Said the buyer wanted a quick transaction. There's no bill of sale in your files. She looked up at him. There's an entry in your ledger that says the sale happened, but the amount recorded is lower than what 14 head would have been worth at March prices by about $60. The silence. I signed something, he said slowly. I didn't read it carefully. There was a lot going on that week. Birch works for Voss, she said. Not officially. I can't prove it yet. But I found 3 other transactions in the past 2 years that Birch facilitated, and every one of them has the same pattern. Paperwork that's technically complete, but financially disadvantageous, handled fast enough that there wasn't time to review it properly. Mercer sat down in the other chair, the old one against the wall, and was quiet. She ate some of the beans. They'd gone cold, but she was hungry enough not to care. This is bigger than I thought it was, he said finally. Yes. What do we do with it? We finish building the case, she said, and then we take it somewhere it can't be ignored. He looked at her, a long, direct look, the kind that she'd learned to brace for from men because it usually preceded something she didn't want to hear. But what he said was, how did you learn all of this? The financial tracking, the contracts? Where does it come from? She blinked. I taught myself, she said. Books, mostly. My mother had some books. She'd been a schoolteacher before she married my father. She left them to me, and the mercantile in town used to let me read their trade journals when business was slow. Your father didn't... My father thought it was a waste of time, she said. He was wrong about a lot of things. Mercer nodded, didn't push, just accepted it. The way she'd stated it and moved on. She was still trying to figure out what to do with a man who did that. Get some sleep, he said, standing. The books will be here in the morning. 1 more hour. 1 more hour, he agreed, and left her to it. That night, lying in the narrow bed with the east pasture quiet outside the window, she thought about the promise she'd made to herself on the auction platform. Never again. Never again would she trust a man with her dignity, her future, her life. She thought about Gideon Mercer, who had spent $22 not to own her but to make sure someone worse didn't. She thought about Pete Calloway, who held fence posts steady and didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. She thought about Charlie Dow, who had stopped staring at her within the first week and had started doing the things she pointed out needed doing without being asked twice. She turned over in the narrow bed and looked at the window and the dark Montana sky beyond it. Trust isn't the same as faith, she told herself. I don't have to trust anyone. I just have to keep my eyes open. It was a reasonable position. She was almost certain she believed it. Outside, something moved in the east pasture, a deer maybe, or just the wind through the grass, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so peaceful that she was asleep before she finished the thought. In the morning, she found 3 more discrepancies. By the time she'd mapped them all, she had the shape of something that was no longer just questionable. It was a pattern, deliberate and designed, the financial architecture of a man who had been quietly starving this ranch for years, waiting for the moment when its owner would have no choice but to sell. She looked at what she'd built across the desk. The notes, the cross-references, the copied figures, the original contracts with their buried clauses, and she felt something clarify inside her. She'd come here with nothing. $4 in her pocket and a promise to herself and nowhere to go. But she was here now. And she was good at this. She was good at reading what numbers were hiding, good at seeing the shape of a problem, good at finding the thread and following it to its source. Silas Voss had built a cage around this ranch, one careful bar at a time. She was going to dismantle it, not for Gideon Mercer, not out of gratitude or obligation or any of the things that women in her situation were supposed to feel. For herself. Because she'd been handed a problem she could solve, and she was done letting men like Silas Voss and men like her father decide what the world looked like. She picked up her pen and started writing. The Mercer Ranch sat quiet under the September sky, and inside it, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, someone was paying attention to exactly the right things. By the end of her 4th week at the Mercer Ranch, Abigail had stopped thinking of the spare room as temporary. She hadn't made a decision about it exactly. It was more that the thought of leaving had moved from the front of her mind to somewhere further back, replaced by the more immediate problem of what Silas Voss had been doing to this ranch, and how to prove it in a way that couldn't be argued away. The work had a gravity to it that she hadn't expected, not the weight of obligation, but the weight of something genuinely worth doing, which was different and considerably harder to walk away from. She was making a second copy of the grain account discrepancies on a Wednesday morning when Pete knocked on the study door frame and said there was a rider coming up the north road. She went to the window. The rider was moving at an unhurried pace, which wasn't the pace of someone bringing emergency news. He was well-dressed for a ranch call. Too well-dressed, she thought. Clean coat, good horse, the general presentation of someone who wanted to be seen as prosperous. "Who's that?" she asked. "That," Pete said, with a flatness in his voice that told her everything she needed to know about his feelings on the subject, "is Dale Hurst. He works for Voss, handles the account relations." She was back at the desk and had the ledgers closed and stacked before the rider had reached the hitching post. Gideon came in from the east pasture, still in his work coat, wiping his hands on a cloth. He'd seen the rider, too. His expression as he came through the door was the careful, neutral one he wore when he was paying close attention to something. "Hurst," he said, not quite to Abigail, not quite to Pete, just identifying the situation. "You want me to stay?" Abigail asked. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know." She didn't move from the study doorway. He went out to meet Hurst on the porch, and she listened from just inside. Dale Hurst had a voice that was practiced at being pleasant, smooth in the way of someone who'd spent years making difficult conversations sound like friendly ones, the particular tone that salesmen and lawyers and men who wanted something from you learned early and used constantly. "Gideon, good to see you. You're looking well. Ranch looking good too. I noticed you've been working on the west fence." "Dale?" Gideon's voice was unrevealing. "What brings you out?" "Just a routine check-in, really. Mr. Voss likes to stay in touch with his account holders personally. That's always been his way. He values the relationship." A brief pause. "He also wanted me to mention that he's had some interest from buyers in the Northern Territory parcels. High pasture, creek access, that kind of thing is getting harder to find, and some of these investors are willing to pay fair market plus. He just thought as a courtesy, he'd let you know the opportunity exists if you ever wanted to discuss it." Silence. Abigail counted 4 seconds of it. "I appreciate the courtesy," Gideon said. "Tell Silas I'm not looking to sell." Of course. No pressure at all. He just wanted you to have the information." Another smooth pause. "How are the books treating you? Good season, despite the drought?" "We're managing." "Glad to hear it. If you ever have questions about your account terms, Mr. Voss is always open to conversation. Very flexible man, Silas." Hurst's voice had a particular quality on that last sentence, a tiny edge beneath the pleasantness, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "He believes in working with people." "I'll keep that in mind." She heard the creak of the porch boards as Hurst descended to his horse, and then his voice one more time, lightly, almost casually. "I noticed you've got someone new on the property. Young woman?" "My bookkeeper," Gideon said, and nothing else. A pause that lasted a beat too long. "Ah, well. Good day, Gideon." She listened to the horse move away down the road. Then Gideon came back inside, and the careful neutrality had left his face, replaced by something harder underneath it. "He was counting windows," Pete said from behind her. She turned. She hadn't heard him come back in. Counting people. Taking inventory. I know, Gideon said. Abigail looked down at the stack of closed ledgers on the desk. They know I'm here, she said, and they don't know yet what I've found, but they're wondering why you suddenly have a bookkeeper. Does that change what we're doing? Gideon asked her directly. She considered that honestly. It changed the timeline. If Voss was sending someone to assess the situation, it meant he was paying closer attention to this ranch than they'd realized, which meant there was less margin for error, less time to build the complete case before he decided to escalate whatever pressure he'd already been applying. It means we move faster, she said. The next morning she was at the desk before dawn. She'd been methodical up until now. Thorough, careful, making sure every connection she drew was supported by at least 2 independent sources. She kept that discipline but picked up the pace, working through the lunch hour with the ledgers open around her and her own notes expanding across a second pad of paper she'd found in the bottom drawer. The picture she was building was larger than she'd initially thought, and the more she saw of it, the more she understood that Silas Voss wasn't just squeezing one ranch. The Mercer account was one piece of something that looked, from the inside of these books, like a systematic regional operation. He was doing the same thing to every independent rancher in the valley who wasn't either large enough to push back or connected enough to notice. Small discrepancies in pricing, strategic clauses in water agreements, insurance arrangements that looked like protection and functioned like traps. She found the most important thing on a Thursday afternoon in a folder she almost didn't open because it was labeled, in faded pencil, My S. Correspondence 1881-83, and looked like the kind of folder that contained nothing useful. It contained a land survey, not the standard county survey she'd already examined. This was an older document, handwritten, stamped with the Territorial Land Office seal from 1878. It documented the original boundary lines of what was now the Mercer Ranch and 3 neighboring properties. And the boundary lines on this document were not the same as the boundary lines on the current county records. She sat with that for a long moment, making very sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. The Harlow Creek watershed, the northern water source that made this land valuable, extended further south on the original survey than it did on the current county map. On the original document, 2 additional ranches had explicit water access rights. On the current county records, those rights were absent. Someone had redrawn the lines. She didn't say anything to Gideon that evening. She needed to be certain. She went back through everything twice, checking dates, checking signatures, checking the chain of recorded transfers in the county ledger copies she'd requested from Millhaven's records office 3 weeks ago, and which had arrived bundled in brown paper that she'd set aside for when she needed them. She needed them now. She untied the bundle and spread the county records across the desk alongside the old survey and spent 2 hours doing nothing but comparing signatures and dates. The county records had been amended in 1881. The amendment was on a standard form, signed by a county registrar named Thomas Alden, and it had changed the watershed boundary language in a way that appeared technical and minor, and had the practical effect of removing water access rights from 2 downstream ranchers. Thomas Alden had retired from the registrar's office in 1882. He now worked as Silas Voss's property manager. Abigail set down her pen and sat back in the chair and stared at the wall for a moment. This wasn't just account manipulation. This wasn't just predatory contract terms. This was fraud. Specific, documented, legally actionable fraud. Falsification of official land records to strip property rights from ranchers who hadn't known to look for the change. Years of groundwork, laid carefully, designed to accumulate into control over the valley's most critical resource. She heard the front door and Gideon's boots in the main room, and she said, loudly enough to carry through the doorway, "I need to show you something." He appeared in the study doorway still in his coat, and she could tell from his face that something in her voice had already told him this was different from the previous things she'd shown him. She spread the 2 documents side by side on the desk and walked him through it. She tried to be clear and methodical, not dramatic, just the facts in the order she'd found them. But her hands weren't entirely steady by the time she got to the part about Thomas Alden's employment history, and she could hear something in her own voice that was closer to anger than she usually let herself get. Gideon didn't speak for a long time after she finished. He looked at the 2 surveys with his hands braced on the desk edge, and she watched him work through it, could almost see him tracing the same path she'd traced, arriving at the same place. "The 2 ranches that lost water rights," he said, "Connolly's Place and the Hartman Spread. You know them?" Connolly sold out 4 years ago, said the drought hit him harder than it hit anyone else, and he couldn't recover. Something in his jaw tightened. He had good land, good water, or should have had. I never understood why he struggled so much when the rest of us were managing. Because he wasn't supposed to have water access anymore, Abigail said, according to the amended records, which meant Voss could offer him a low price because everyone looking at the records would see a property with compromised water rights, which would be worth less. And the Hartmans? Still on their land, as far as I can tell. I don't have their financial records, obviously, but if Voss is applying the same methods he's applying here— I know them, Gideon said. He straightened up. I need to talk to them. You can't do that yet, she said. He looked at her. Not yet, she repeated. If Voss hears that you're talking to the Hartmans about their finances, he'll know what we've found. And if he knows what we've found before we've built a complete case— She stopped. Let him complete the logic himself. He did. She could see it in his face. He'll move first, he said. He has more money and more connections than you do. If he decides he needs to neutralize the situation before it gets to a hearing, he has tools to do that. She kept her voice even. We need the complete case. Every document, every cross-reference, every piece of evidence organized so that someone with authority can't look at it and find a reasonable alternative explanation. Then we take it all at once. Gideon was quiet for a moment. How much longer? 2 weeks? Maybe 3. She watched him accept that. Watched him take the 3 weeks of patience and put it somewhere he could carry it. He wasn't a patient man by nature, she'd come to understand that. He was the kind of man who preferred to handle a problem directly, to move toward it rather than around it. Waiting didn't come naturally to him. The fact that he was doing it anyway was something she noted and didn't comment on. 3 weeks, he said. I'll try to make it 2. He nodded and went to wash up for dinner, and she turned back to the desk and picked up her pen. The thing she didn't tell him, because she was still working out how to say it. Somewhere in the course of building this case, it had stopped being just his problem that she was solving. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. It might have been the moment she found the old survey and felt the specific fury of seeing how systematically and how long this had been going on. It might have been earlier, maybe the evening Pete held the fence post steady and she understood that this place, worn and struggling as it was, operated on a principle of people doing what needed doing without requiring applause for it. She wrote for another 2 hours. Outside, the Montana sky went dark, and she could hear the ranch settling around her. Pete and Charlie's voices from the bunkhouse, the distant sound of the cattle, the particular evening quiet of a place that worked hard and rested when it could. She kept writing. The week that followed was its own kind of difficult. Not dramatic, nothing caught fire, nobody showed up threatening, just the slow, grinding work of documentation. She sent 3 letters to county offices requesting records, using careful language that didn't flag what she was looking for. She cross-referenced every account entry she could find against external records. She built a timeline that ran from 1878 to the present, tracking Voss's expansion through the valley, one purchase and one amended record and one squeezed-out rancher at a time. Charlie Dow found her asleep at the desk one morning and quietly put a blanket over her shoulders before he went out, which she pretended not to know about. On a Friday evening, she came out of the study to find Gideon and Pete sitting on the porch in the last of the daylight. And Pete was telling a story about a horse he'd had 20 years ago, and Gideon was laughing, actually laughing, the kind that was involuntary and unguarded. And she stood in the doorway for a moment before she went out to join them, because she wanted to see it from a slight distance first. This ordinary moment of 2 men who'd known each other a long time sitting in the evening air, and she wanted to locate whatever feeling it produced in her before she had to put a name to it. She joined them. Pete told the rest of the horse story, which ended badly for the horse, but with a punchline that made even Abigail's mouth do something reluctant and genuine. She sat in the 3rd chair and looked out at the valley, and tried to remember the last time she'd sat somewhere in the evening, and felt, if not exactly safe, at least like the people around her meant her no harm. She couldn't think of one. "You're thinking," Pete said. "I'm always thinking." "About the case?" "Not right now." He nodded with a satisfaction that she couldn't quite account for. Gideon was looking out at the land, the last light catching the grass, and his face and profile had the quality she'd noticed a few times now, a kind of honest tiredness, nothing hidden behind it, just the face of a man who'd worked hard and was resting and wasn't trying to appear otherwise. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that this was unusual. She'd spent her life around men who were performing something: confidence, authority, nonchalance, strength, whatever the moment seemed to require. Gideon Mercer performed nothing, as far as she could tell. He was just exactly as present as he was, no more and no less. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She'd been turning it over for weeks, like a piece of work with a problem she hadn't solved, examining it from different angles, trying to find the catch. She hadn't found one. That itself was suspicious, because in her experience, there was always a catch. She went back inside before dark and picked up her pen. The letter from the Millhaven Records office arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after she'd requested it, and it contained the one piece she'd been waiting for: a certified copy of the original 81 amendment to the watershed boundary, with the original filing date, the registrar's seal, and most importantly, a secondary signature she hadn't known was there. The second signature was Silas Voss's. He hadn't just benefited from the boundary change, he'd co-signed the amendment, which meant he hadn't corrupted Thomas Alden or used him without his knowledge. He'd been there, personally, when the record was altered. His name was on the document. The document was now in her hands, certified and dated. She sat very still for a moment with the paper in front of her. Then she carefully placed it in the folder she'd labeled, in her own handwriting, Evidence, Do Not Move, and put that folder in the bottom drawer of the desk, and she went out to find Gideon. He was in the barn, doing something with a saddle. The repair work, the daily maintenance. She'd noticed that he didn't delegate the small, unglamorous tasks, did them himself alongside Pete and Charlie. Another thing she'd filed away and not commented on. "Gideon," she said from the barn doorway. He looked up. "I have everything I need." He set down the saddle. "All of it?" "All of it. The altered survey, the financial discrepancies, the insurance arrangements, the water rights amendment, with Voss's own signature on the original document." He came toward her, and she registered something in his expression that she hadn't seen directed at her before from any man. Not admiration exactly, something more specific than that. Something that recognized what the work had actually cost. "How much time did this take?" he said. "A month, give or take. I've been losing ground on this for 4 years and I didn't see any of it." "You weren't looking for it," she said. "You were too busy trying to keep the ranch running. That's what he was counting on, that you'd be too occupied with the immediate problems to step back and look at the pattern." Gideon leaned against the barn door. Outside, Charlie was moving a group of cattle across the south pasture, and the sound of it, hooves and the occasional low complaint, came through the afternoon air. "What happens now?" he said. We need to get to the county commissioner's office in Helena," she said. "Not the Millhaven magistrate. Voss has too much reach there. The territorial commissioner is independent enough that a case like this can be heard properly." She paused. "There's also the Hartmans. If they have evidence of the same manipulation, their own discrepancies, their own strange insurance terms, it strengthens the case to have multiple complainants. You said not to talk to them yet. I said not to talk to them before we had the complete case. We have it now." She looked at him steadily. "But you have to decide that. They're your neighbors. You know them better than I do. If you trust them, I trust them. Then we go to them with what we have. Show them the boundary amendment. Let them see what's been done." She stopped. "Some of this will be hard to prove without their cooperation. The pattern becomes undeniable with multiple properties showing the same methods." Gideon nodded slowly. "When do we go?" "Give me 2 more days to organize everything into something a commissioner can follow without having to take my word for the connections." She almost said something else. Stopped herself. "What?" he said. She looked at him, at the tiredness in his face, the solid, stubborn competence of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for 4 years without knowing what he was fighting against. "When we go to Helena," she said, "I should present it, the case. I built it. I know every piece of it and why it matters and how to explain it so that someone who doesn't have your stake in the outcome can follow the logic." Something moved through his expression. She couldn't quite read it. "I wasn't going to suggest otherwise," he said. She'd braced for an argument that didn't come, and now she didn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. "Most men would want to—" "I want to win," he said simply. "I want the ranch back on solid ground, and Voss held accountable, and the Hartmans and whoever else he's done this to having their rights restored. What I want isn't the same as who's best positioned to get it. He held her gaze with the same direct quality she'd stopped trying to brace against because it was never what she expected. You built this case. You know it better than I do, so you present it. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was, despite everything, not used to that. Not used to being the logical choice, and having someone simply agree that she was the logical choice without requiring her to argue for it. 2 more days, she said finally. She went back to the desk. That evening, after dinner, she was in the study reorganizing the final folder structure when she heard Pete's voice in the kitchen, low and serious, and then Gideon's answering. She wasn't trying to listen, but the house was small enough that sound carried. She found it all, Pete was saying, every bit of it. In a month. I've been watching that man shortchange this operation for 2 years, and I never saw the shape of it the way she laid it out. A silence from Gideon. I'm just saying, Pete said, and then his voice dropped enough that she couldn't hear the rest. She turned back to her papers. The lamp threw warm light across the desk, across the months of careful work arranged in front of her. The evidence of a fraud built slowly and dismantled the same way, one document at a time. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the grass in the east pasture with a sound like water, and she could see the edge of the mountains against the night sky, holding their snow line. She thought about Silas Voss, had never met him, knew him entirely through what he'd left behind in the paper record. Knew the shape of his ambition, the methodology of his patience, the way he'd built his empire of small deceptions. He was going to find out, probably soon, that someone had been paying attention. That the meticulous machinery he'd assembled over years was not as invisible as he'd believed. She wasn't afraid of that exactly. She was clear-eyed about it. She'd been clear-eyed since the morning she found the old survey. There would be a response. Men like Voss didn't accept being exposed quietly. She pressed her pen to the page and kept writing, and the lamp stayed lit, and the Montana night settled dark and cold around the ranch. And somewhere in the east pasture the grass moved in the wind like it had been doing for 1,000 years, and would keep doing long after all of them were gone. She still had 2 more days of work to get through. She didn't intend to waste a single hour of them. The 2 days she'd promised herself stretched into 3, because on the second afternoon a writer came from town with a folded paper that was not a letter. It was a notice. Abigail read it twice standing in the doorway, then carried it to the desk and read it a 3rd time, slowly, the way she did when she needed to make sure she wasn't misreading something because she wanted to misread it. She wasn't misreading it. The notice was from the Millhaven Valley Cattlemen's Association, a body she'd known existed but hadn't given much thought to, since Gideon had mentioned only passing involvement with it. The notice informed Gideon Mercer that, following a review of membership standards, his account with Voss Agricultural had been flagged for outstanding balance review, and that pending resolution of said review, his cattle would be ineligible for registration at the autumn market in Helena, which meant he couldn't legally sell a single head at the territory's largest cattle market, which meant no income from the herd for this season. The review had been filed by a representative of Voss Agricultural. She sat down in the desk chair and put the notice flat on the table in front of her and pressed both palms against the wood and breathed. He was moving. Voss knew something had changed. Dale Hurst's visit, the new bookkeeper, some other signal she hadn't been able to control. And he wasn't waiting to find out what it meant. He was applying pressure now, cutting off income channels, making the immediate financial situation painful enough that Gideon would be too distracted managing the crisis to look at the larger picture. It was the same methodology she'd been documenting for weeks, just accelerated. She heard Gideon come in from the north pasture. She didn't call out to him, let him wash up, let him come to the study on his own timeline, which he did about 10 minutes later with the look of a man who'd seen the rider come and go and was bracing for news. She handed him the notice without preamble. She watched him read it, watched his jaw tighten, then deliberately loosen, the small controlled thing he did when something made him angry and he didn't want it to show too much. He can't do this, Gideon said. He's doing it, she said. The Cattlemen's Association is technically independent, but look at the board composition. She'd already pulled the association's published charter from her correspondence folder. She'd requested it weeks ago as background. She found the page and put it in front of him. 3 of the 7 board members have financial relationships with Voss. One of them is his brother-in-law. Gideon looked at the page, then at her. You already knew about this. I knew it was a potential pressure point. I didn't think he'd use it this fast. What does this do to the timeline? She'd been working that out for the past 10 minutes. It makes Helena more urgent, not less. The market is in 6 weeks. If we can get the commissioner to issue even a preliminary review order before then, it should be enough to freeze the association's action pending investigation. She paused. But we need to go now, within the week. Then we go within the week. I need 1 more day on the documentation. You've got it. He set the notice down. She noticed he put it face down, which was probably deliberate. Then he said, I should have known this was coming. You couldn't have known the specifics, not the specifics, the general direction. He moved to the window and looked out at the land with the posture of someone having a private argument. I kept thinking, if I just work hard enough, manage well enough, hold on long enough, eventually it evens out. Eventually the ranch is on solid enough ground that the bad seasons don't threaten everything. He stopped. That's not how it works when someone's working against you on purpose. No, she said, it's not. I lost 3 years thinking that. She didn't have anything to say to that. It was true, and saying it wasn't your fault would have been the kind of thing you said to make someone feel better in the moment. And she didn't think that was what he needed. What she said instead was, the documentation is solid. What he's doing now, this notice, this pressure, it's actually going to help the case. It shows a pattern of retaliation consistent with someone who's aware their actions are being scrutinized. He turned from the window. You're angry, he said. She blinked. I'm focused. You're both. He said it without accusation, just observation, like noting the weather. I can tell the difference. When you're just focused, you're very still. When you're angry, your hands do something. She looked down at her hands. She'd been pressing her left thumb into her right palm without being aware of it. A small grinding pressure. She stopped. He's been doing this to people who couldn't see it coming, she said. People who worked their whole lives on their land and then couldn't figure out why everything kept getting harder. Connolly sold out for less than his property was worth and probably didn't know why he was failing. The Hartmans are still on their land, but they're being compressed the same way. She picked up her pen. So yes, I'm a little angry. Good, Gideon said quietly. She wasn't expecting that. She looked up. Use it, he said, and went back outside to work. She used it. She worked until past midnight, and the documentation when she finished was the cleanest, most thoroughly organized thing she'd ever produced. Every number cross-referenced, every connection noted and sourced, the full timeline laid out so clearly that a person with no prior knowledge of any of it could read through in sequence and arrive at only one possible conclusion. She sat back and looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of having done something exactly as well as it could be done. Not better than her circumstances allowed. Not considering the limitations. Just, well, actually well. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. They left for the Hartman place the next morning. The Hartman ranch was 12 miles southeast, which in that country meant a 2-hour drive on a road that couldn't fully decide whether it was a road or a suggestion. Gideon drove. Abigail rode beside him with the documentation folder on her lap and watched the land move past. The Hartmans were a husband and wife, Ernst and Clara, both in their late 50s, German-born and territory-raised, with 3 adult sons who worked the land with them. They met the wagon in the yard with the cautious welcome of people who didn't get many visitors and had learned to be careful about the ones they did get. Clara Hartman looked at Abigail with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who'd built something hard with her hands and measured people accordingly. Abigail met the gaze steadily and waited. Come inside, Clara said. There's coffee. They sat at the Hartman's kitchen table, and Abigail laid the documentation out in sections, organized the way she'd planned it, and walked Ernst and Clara through it piece by piece. She didn't editorialize. She let the numbers speak. She showed them the boundary amendment with Voss's signature. She showed them the pattern of pricing discrepancies. She showed them where their own property name appeared in the cross-referenced records, not their private records, which she didn't have access to, but the county and association records that were public, showing the same applied pressure she'd documented at the Mercer Ranch. Clara Hartman got very still about halfway through. Ernst Hartman's face did something complicated. He was a large man with a broad, weathered face and the hands of someone who'd worked cattle for 40 years. And watching him process what she was showing him was like watching a very old tree react to wind. The movement was slow and deep. "The water rights," Clara said. "We've been fighting about the water rights for 3 years. Every time we try to renegotiate, there's a delay, or a new requirement, or someone from Voss's office tells us the survey records need to be pulled and reviewed." "Because he doesn't want them reviewed," Abigail said. "The review would reveal the amended boundary, so the process gets delayed indefinitely." "Our lawyer and Helena said it was bureaucratic backlog," Ernst said. His voice was flat. "Said these things take time." "Who recommended your lawyer?" Gideon asked. A silence. Clara Hartman looked at her husband. Something passed between them that was the language of a long marriage, a whole conversation in a shared glance. Then she looked at Abigail. "Dale Hurst," she said, 2 years ago. He said the man was very good and very affordable." Abigail wrote the name down on a separate page. "I'll want to document that. You don't have to name him in the formal complaint if you're concerned about liability, but it establishes the pattern." "We'll name him," Clara said. Ernst looked at her. She looked back at him with the same expression she'd had before, except this one had a different quality. Something decided in it. "We'll name all of them." They stayed at the Hartman place through the afternoon, going through everything carefully, answering questions, letting Ernst and Clara take their own time with the documents they needed to look at more than once. Clara turned out to have a sharp head for numbers. She caught 2 connections that Abigail had documented but hadn't highlighted, saw their significance immediately, and asked 3 questions that made Abigail go back through her own notes to verify the answers. She liked Clara Hartman. Driving back in the early evening, the mountains going rose and purple ahead of them, Gideon said, "That went better than I expected." "They're angry," she said. "Angry people either shut down or mobilize. Those 2 mobilize." "You read people pretty quick." "I read evidence. People leave evidence the same way finances do." She looked out at the passing land. Clara had suspected something for 2 years. She just didn't have the documentation to substantiate it. We gave her that. "And Ernst?" "Ernst trusts his wife. He'll do whatever she decides." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He's a lucky man," he said. Not to her quite. More to himself, the road maybe. She didn't answer. The evening light was doing something remarkable to the grass, turning it all to gold, the kind of gold that's almost orange, the specific color of September in the territory when the angle of the light is exactly right. She watched it instead of looking for something to say. They were 5 miles from the ranch when it happened. She saw the smoke first, a column of it, wrong-colored, not cooking smoke, not the thin gray of a fireplace, black and wide, climbing fast. "That's your barn," she said. Gideon had already seen it. He didn't say anything. He just pushed the horses, and she held on to the seat rail and watched the smoke grow. It was fully involved by the time they came up the road, the whole east section of the barn burning, the dry September wood taking it fast, the heat reaching them 50 yards out. Charlie Dow was running a bucket line from the water trough, which was not going to be enough, was nowhere near enough, but he was doing it anyway. Pete was at the fence of the near pasture, working the gate, getting the horses out. She was off the wagon before it stopped moving, not because she knew what to do exactly, just because standing on the wagon while the barn burned felt wrong in her body. She ran toward Pete. "The cattle out already," he said, without stopping what he was doing. "Got the horses. Need to get them far enough back they don't spook into the fence." He was out of breath, moving fast for a 60-year-old man, and she took the gate from him and managed it while he handled the last 2 horses, talking to them in a low, steady voice that cut through even the noise of the fire. She heard Gideon behind her, heard his voice checking in with Charlie, heard Charlie say something about where it had started. The east corner, fast, too fast, like something had been put to it, and heard Gideon's silence in response to that, which was its own kind of answer. She looked back at the barn. The roof section she'd identified weeks ago as structurally compromised was gone, collapsed inward. The rest was following. Nothing they had could stop it. Then she heard Pete make a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Not words, just a sharp cut-off sound. And she turned. He was looking at the barn with an expression she didn't understand immediately, and then he said, "Walt?" And she understood. "Who is Walt?" she said. "Rides through sometimes, sleeps in the barn when he's between places." Pete's voice was stripped down to something basic. He was there this morning. I saw him. The three of them, Abigail, Pete, Charlie, looked at the barn, at the fire, which had the east wall now, and was working its way along the north. She looked for Gideon. He was already moving toward the barn. Not cautiously, not pausing to assess, moving toward it with the particular purposeful speed of someone who has made a decision and committed to it and is now just executing. Gideon! Pete's voice behind her. She was already moving too, without deciding to. Gideon, stop! He didn't stop. He got the side door open, the one that wasn't yet fully involved, and went in. The seconds that followed were the longest she'd experienced since the auction platform. She stood 10 feet from the barn door with the heat pressing against her face and the smoke thickening, and she did not breathe. She did not move. She did not do anything except watch that door. Pete was next to her. She could feel him not breathing either. Charlie said something she didn't register. Gideon came out. He was supporting an old man, thin and white-haired, half-conscious, coughing, with one arm around his shoulders and one hand covering the old man's face. Both of them were dark with smoke. Gideon's left arm was bleeding from somewhere, a line of red along the back of his forearm that she registered and cataloged and did not yet react to because he was upright, he was walking, he was out. Pete got Walt's other arm. Together they moved him far enough back from the heat, lowered him to the ground. Walt was coughing hard, conscious enough to cough, which meant conscious enough to breathe. His hands were shaking. Abigail was at Gideon's arm before she'd processed doing it, looking at the cut. A burn, she realized on closer inspection, not a cut. Long and already blistering along the outer forearm, probably from a piece of falling structure. "You need to wash this," she said. "Walt. Pete has Walt. You need to wash this now before it gets worse." He looked at her. His face was dark with soot except where the sweat had cut through it, and his eyes in all of that darkness were very clear. "He's all right," he said, meaning Walt, not himself. "He's breathing and he's coughing. That's better than it could be." She had his arm in her hands, leading him toward the water trough, and he went without argument. "What were you thinking?" she said, because she couldn't not say it. "I was thinking there was a man inside. You could have—" She stopped. The thing she was about to say was, "You could have died," and it arrived in her chest with a weight that surprised her. She pressed her mouth together and focused on the arm, on the burn, on the practical immediate task of cleaning the wound with the cleanest water she could get to. He said quietly, "There was a man inside." "I know," she said. "I know." They stood at the water trough while the barn finished burning behind them, and she cleaned the burn on his arm with methodical hands, and he held still for it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Walt survived the night at the Mercer house, sleeping in the main room on a bedroll Pete arranged. His lungs were strained and he was badly shaken, but he was alive, which was the only thing that mattered, and by the following morning he was well enough to sit up and eat, which was the thing that mattered next. He told them, when he was ready, what he'd seen. He'd been asleep in the corner of the barn, the west corner, away from where the fire started, and what woke him was not the smoke but the smell of something that didn't belong. Sharp and chemical. Kerosene, he thought. He'd worked on oil operations in his younger years, and he knew the smell. He'd barely gotten himself to the wall and down to the door before the east corner went up. If Gideon hadn't come in when he did, the smoke would have finished what the fire started. Nobody said arson aloud, but it was in the room with all of them. Abigail looked at the remains of the barn through the kitchen window. The structure was gone. The walls had come down sometime in the night, and what remained was a blackened footprint with sections of standing timber that would need to come down before they were a hazard. The equipment inside, tools, feed, some stored materials, was gone. The cattle were in the south pasture. The horses were in the side corral, spooked and unsettled but unhurt. The house stood. It could have been worse. She kept coming back to that, which was not the same as it being good. Gideon was at the kitchen table with his bandaged arm resting on the surface when she came in from the window. He looked the way people look after a night of no real sleep and sustained shock, hollowed out, a little gray, still processing. "He was making a point," Gideon said. "Yes." "He burned the barn to make a point. He burned it because Dale Hirsch saw me here and told him someone was reading those books, and Voss panicked." She sat down across from him. "Burning the barn tells you two things. You're vulnerable, and he can reach you. He wants you to know both of those things. He wants you to be scared enough to sell before this gets to a hearing. It's not going to a hearing if I don't have the resources to get there, Gideon said. The barn was 2 seasons of saved materials. The equipment alone... He stopped. His jaw worked. I know. I don't know if the ranch can absorb... I know, she said again. Gideon, look at me. He did. He burned the barn because he's afraid of what we built, she said. You don't burn a man's barn over a routine account dispute. You burn it when you're scared of what he has on you. That documentation, she gestured toward the study. It's still there. I moved the critical folder to the house last week. Everything we need is intact. Something moved through his expression. You moved it? I moved it when Hearst came to visit. I kept it in the house after that. She hadn't told him she'd done that. She'd done it quietly, just in case. The way you do the small defensive preparations when you've read enough about how certain kinds of men operate to know that escalation is always possible. He looked at her for a long moment. You thought he might do something like this. I thought he might do something. I didn't know what. And you moved the documents. Yes, he was quiet. Outside, Pete was talking to Walt, the low murmur of it coming through the wall. Charlie was somewhere in the yard. She could hear footsteps, the purposeful back and forth of someone who needed to be doing something physical after a bad night. The Hartmans, Gideon said. I was thinking the same thing. She'd been thinking about it since dawn. If Voss is willing to burn a barn, he might decide to put pressure on them next. They need to know to be careful. I'll ride out today. Take Charlie with you. She paused. I'm going to stay here and write everything down. What happened last night, what Walt told us about the kerosene smell, every detail, dated and witnessed. This becomes part of the documentation. He nodded. Started to stand, then stopped. Abigail. She looked up. The barn, he said. He stopped again, and she understood he was trying to say something about the cost of what had just happened. The concrete material cost, the 2 seasons of effort turned to ash overnight, and finding it genuinely hard to get the words out, because he was not a man who found that kind of loss easy to articulate. I know, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I'm not... He paused. I'm not sorry I went in for Walt. No, she said. Of course you're not, even if it costs me the ranch. She looked at him, at the exhausted, soot-edged, unhesitating man across the table who had walked into a burning barn for an old transient who slept there sometimes, with nothing in that calculation except, there is a man inside. She had spent 6 weeks trying to find the catch, trying to identify the performance, the angle, the thing behind the apparent decency that would eventually make sense of it. She wasn't trying anymore. She thought about her own promise on the auction platform, never again, and she held it in her mind the way you hold something you've been carrying for a long time and are starting to realize is heavier than it's worth. It won't cost you the ranch, she said. Not if I can help it. She picked up her pen and started writing. The rumors started 3 days after the fire. Abigail found out the way most people find out about things being said behind their backs. Not directly, not all at once, but in accumulated small signals that eventually added up to something impossible to ignore. It was Charlie who told her first, because Charlie was 20 years old and hadn't yet learned the art of protecting people from information they needed to have. He came in from town on a Thursday with the feed supplies and set the bags down in the kitchen and stood there with the particular uncomfortable posture of someone carrying something they don't want to carry. What? She said. People are talking, he said. In town. She put down the ledger page she'd been reviewing. About? About you. He looked at the floor, then back up. About you and Gideon. About why you're here and what kind of... He stopped. It's not true. I just want to say that first. Tell me what they're saying. He told her. It took about 2 minutes, and by the end of it, she had a very clear picture of the shape of the story that was circulating in Millhaven. The story that positioned her not as a bookkeeper, but as something else entirely. A woman of loose character who had used the auction as an opportunity, who had insinuated herself into a man's household for purposes that had nothing to do with honest work. The story had details, specific details, the kind that people invent when they want a rumor to have credibility. Some of those details came directly from her father. She recognized his fingerprints on 2 of them. She sat with that for a moment. Who's saying it? She asked. It's all over. Martha Bowles at the dry goods store, the men at the feed office. Charlie shook his head. But it started with someone. Pete says it started with someone. She didn't ask who Pete thought it started with. She already knew. She went back to the study and stood at the desk without sitting down, looking at the organized folders, the completed documentation, the case she'd built piece by piece over 6 weeks. Then she sat down after all. Because standing was just displacement activity, and she had too much to do for displacement activity. The anger came. She let it. It moved through her like weather, and she sat still while it did, and when it passed, she was left with something cleaner underneath. Not calm, not quite, but the working version of calm that you get when emotion stops interfering with function. This was Voss. She was certain of it. The barn hadn't scared them into selling, hadn't driven Gideon to the desperate financial position Voss had intended, and so he'd moved to the next tool available. Reputation. Specifically, hers, because she was the vulnerable one, the woman with the damaged history, the woman who'd been sold at auction and whose father was still in town and still talking. It was smart. She hated that it was smart. Destroying her credibility before the hearing meant anything she presented could be questioned. Consider the source. It was the oldest play available, and it was effective precisely because it was so old. People believed it before they examined it. Gideon came in from the pasture at noon, and she told him directly, no preamble. She watched his face go still in the specific way it did when he was managing a strong reaction. Your father, he said. Some of it, not all of it. My father gave them material, but the shape of the story, the particular way it's framed, that's not my father. My father would have been cruder. She looked at her hands. This is designed to undermine the hearing. If I'm a woman of questionable character with questionable motives, the documentation I present becomes questionable by association. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What do we do? We go to the hearing anyway. She looked up at him. There's nothing we can do about the rumors except demonstrate they're false by presenting evidence that stands on its own. The documentation doesn't change because people are saying things about me. It's not fair to you. No, she agreed. It's not. But we're past the point where fair is the relevant consideration. He sat down on the edge of the desk, not in the chair, just the corner of the desk, close enough that she could see the still healing burn on his forearm where the bandage had been replaced with a simple cloth wrap. He looked at the floor for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as him thinking something through before he said it. I want to say something, he said. She waited. What's being said about you is a lie. Everybody in this house knows it's a lie. Pete and Charlie know it. The Hartmans, when they hear it, will know it. He looked up. You came here because I offered you work, and you took it, and you did it better than I had any right to expect. That's the full truth of the situation. I don't care what the town says. She held his gaze for a moment. The commissioner and Helena might. Then we show him the evidence and let him work it out. He stood. What do we need to do between now and the hearing? She was grateful for the practical question. She needed the practical question. Write to the commissioner's office today confirming the date and the parties. I need to send the Hartmans a copy of the final documentation so they can review it before we get there. She turned to the desk. And I need to compile Walt's statement, his account of the fire, signed and witnessed. That goes in the final folder. I'll get Walt. They spent the rest of the day in motion. Walt, recovered enough to be lucid and angular and faintly embarrassed by the attention, sat at the kitchen table and dictated his account to Abigail while Pete witnessed it, and Charlie went into town to send the telegram to the commissioner's office. Walt's handwriting wasn't reliable enough for a formal document, so Abigail transcribed his words exactly as he said them, reading each sentence back to him before she wrote the next one. And when it was finished, he signed it with a hand that was still slightly unsteady and said, That's right. That's all of it, exactly right. Thank you, she said. He looked at her with the clear eyes of an old man who has seen enough of the world to not be easily surprised by it. You don't have to thank me. I know what I saw. That evening, after dinner, she went out to the porch alone for the first time in several weeks. She'd been staying inside instinctively, working, always working. And the October air, colder now, carrying the first real edge of the coming winter, hit her like something necessary. She could hear the town from here, or rather, she could feel its direction, south, along the valley, where the lights would be coming on in the windows and people would be eating dinner and talking about their days and maybe, in some of those conversations, saying her name in a particular way. She thought about standing on the auction platform, the laughter, her father counting coins. She thought about what she'd promised herself, never again. She turned it over and looked at it honestly. She hadn't trusted the people in this house because she'd been instructed to, or because gratitude required it, or because she'd decided to stop being careful. She'd watched them, Pete's steady competence, Charlie's guileless work ethic, Gideon's plain and uncalculated decency. And what she'd seen over 6 weeks of close proximity was not a performance. It was just people, imperfect and tired and real, doing what they could with what they had. She still didn't trust easily. She wasn't sure she ever would. But she understood now that the promise she'd made on the auction platform, never again, had been made by a woman who needed a wall and couldn't afford to be precise about what she was walling out. She'd walled out everything because everything hurt. The wall wasn't serving her anymore. She knew that. She hadn't quite decided yet what to do about it, but she knew it. She heard the door behind her. Gideon came out with 2 cups and handed her one the same way he always did. Set it near her hand, didn't push it on her, gave her the choice of taking it. She took it. They stood in the cold for a while without talking. The mountains had gone dark against a sky that still held a line of fading color along the western ridge. "I heard from the commissioner's office," he said. "Telegram came back this evening. The hearing is confirmed. 2 weeks. That's enough time." "The Hartmans will be there." Ernst sent a letter back with Charlie. They found their own discrepancies going back 3 years. Clara wants to present some of it herself. "Clara should," Abigail said. "She knows their finances better than Ernst does. She should present what she knows." "She'll be glad to hear you think so." A silence that was, she had come to recognize, one of the comfortable ones. Not a silence that required filling. "What was your mother like?" Gideon asked. The question surprised her enough that she answered without her usual screening process. "Quiet," she said. "Careful. She read everything she could get her hands on, and she taught me to do the same. She died when I was 11. She paused. She would have had some thoughts about this situation. Good thoughts or bad? Both, probably. She looked at the last line of light over the mountains. She would have said something practical. She was practical, even when things were terrible. She didn't spend much time on why. She spent time on what now. Sensible woman? Yes. A pause. My father was different before she died. Not good, exactly. I don't want to revise that, but different. Less mean. The meanness came in after and just stayed. She hadn't said that to anyone before. She wasn't sure why she said it now. Possibly the cold, possibly the dark, possibly just the accumulated effect of 6 weeks of proximity to someone who didn't use what she told him as leverage. I'm sorry, he said, simply, without overreaching it. It was a long time ago. Doesn't always matter how long ago. She didn't have an answer to that, because it was true. They went back inside. She had work to finish before morning. The 2 weeks moved the way high-stakes waiting always does. Too slowly, and then suddenly, all at once. She used every hour of it. She cross-checked everything one final time. She organized the folder into 3 copies. One for the commissioner, one for their own record, one as a backup that she left with the Hartmans when they rode out the day before departure. She wrote a cover letter that summarized the case in plain language, anticipated the most likely objections, and addressed each one with a specific reference document. She also wrote, in a separate short letter, a clean account of her own background, her father, the auction, the circumstances of her arrival at the Mercer Ranch, and included it voluntarily in the submission. Not because she was required to, because she knew Voss or his attorneys would raise it, and she preferred to raise it herself first, on her own terms, with her own framing. Gideon read that letter when she showed it to him and was quiet for a moment. You don't have to put this in, he said. I know. It's your private history. It's going to become public history the moment Voss's lawyer mentions it in that hearing room, she said. I'd rather it come from me. He handed it back. Then it should come from you. They left for Helena on a Monday morning, the 5 of them, Gideon and Abigail in the wagon, Pete and Charlie following on horseback because Pete had said simply, I'm coming, and Charlie had said me too, and nobody had argued. The Hartmans were traveling separately, and would meet them at the hotel the evening before the hearing. The drive to Helena was 8 hours. They stopped twice. Somewhere around the 5th hour, with the city still ahead and the mountains to the west catching the afternoon sun, Charlie said from his horse, "What if it doesn't work?" Pete said, "It'll work." "But if it doesn't, it'll work," Pete said, in the tone of a man who is not actually certain but has decided certainty is the more useful position. Abigail didn't say anything. She was going through the sequence in her head for the last time, the way she always did before something that mattered, the order of the documents, the logic of the presentation, the 3 points she needed the commissioner to retain when everything else had washed through. She'd done this enough times in her head that it was nearly involuntary now. She was not nervous. She was something more focused than nervous, something that had no good name, the state of being entirely present in what you're doing because the alternatives are unacceptable. Beside her, Gideon drove and didn't speak, and she was grateful for that too. They arrived in Helena at dusk and found the Hartmans already at the hotel. Clara at the front desk with the expression of a woman who had inspected the room and found it adequate but not impressive. She greeted Abigail with a brief, firm handshake and said, "I've been through our ledgers. I found something else." "Tell me over dinner," Abigail said. What Clara had found over dinner at the hotel's ground floor eating room with the 5 of them and Ernst and 2 of the Hartman sons crowded around a table meant for 4 was another layer of the water rights manipulation. A document she'd found in a box of her late father-in-law's papers that predated the boundary amendment and showed the original watershed allocation in even more explicit terms than the survey Abigail had found. Abigail read it twice and put it carefully in the folder. "This goes in first," she said, "before everything else. This is the original record against which every subsequent manipulation can be measured." Clara nodded. She had a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched because she was thinking too hard to remember it. "Are you sure about this?" Ernst asked. He was looking at his wife. "Voss has lawyers. So does the Territorial Commissioner's office," Clara said, "and the law says what it says about forged land records. It doesn't say it more gently because the man who forged them has money." Ernst looked at Gideon across the table. Gideon looked back. Something passed between them. The particular recognition of 2 men who have each independently arrived at the same understanding of the women beside them. Pete reached for the breadbasket. "Let's eat," he said. "Long day tomorrow." They ate. It wasn't comfortable, too much tension in the room for comfort, but it was real, and the food was warm, and for a little while the conversation moved away from documents and hearings and into the small, ordinary territory of people sharing a meal. Charlie got into a discussion with the younger Hartman's son about horses that had nothing to do with any of it and lasted 20 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of that, Abigail felt some specific portion of the weight she'd been carrying ease slightly, not because the problem was solved, but because she was not carrying it alone. After dinner, she went back to her room and went through the documents one final time and then put them away and did not take them out again. She lay in the dark and thought about what the morning held. Silas Voss would be there. She had no doubt of that. She didn't know what he looked like. She knew him entirely by the record he'd left, the shape of his choices over 20 years of careful predation. She thought about walking into that hearing room and meeting him in person for the first time after all of that. She thought about the auction platform, the laughter, the feeling of standing above a crowd that had already decided what she was worth. She was going to walk into a room full of people tomorrow and tell the truth, and she was going to do it with everything she had, and she was going to be good enough. She had to be good enough, and she was going to be because she had built something solid and true, and nobody, not Voss, not his lawyers, not the rumors from Millhaven, not her father's particular brand of damage, was going to take it apart. She turned on her side and looked at the dark window. Tomorrow she was going to dismantle a man's empire piece by piece in front of everyone with $22 worth of chance and 6 weeks of work and everything she had. She closed her eyes. She slept. The commissioner's hearing room in Helena was smaller than she'd imagined. She didn't know exactly what she'd been picturing. Something more imposing, maybe. High ceilings, formal arrangement, the architectural weight of official consequence. What she got was a long rectangular room with 4 windows on the north wall, a raised platform at the front where the 3 commissioners sat behind a plain wooden table, and rows of chairs filling the rest of the space that were, by 8 in the morning, already nearly full. She stood in the doorway for a moment and took inventory. Silas Voss was already there. She knew him immediately. Not because she'd seen him before, but because he occupied the room the way powerful men usually did, with a settled quality that assumed the space around him was naturally his. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 65, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had probably been commanding in its youth and now carried mostly authority by habit. He had 2 lawyers beside him and 3 other men she didn't recognize arranged at his back, associates probably, or witnesses he'd arranged to call. He was talking quietly to one of the lawyers when she walked in, and he glanced toward the door with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to knowing who was in a room. His gaze landed on her, moved past, came back, stayed. She held it for 2 seconds, then walked to the front left table where the Hartmans were already seated, spread her folder open, and did not look at him again. Clara leaned over. "He's been watching the door since we got here," she said quietly. "I know. He didn't think you'd actually come." "I know that too." Gideon settled into the chair beside her. Pete and Charlie and the Hartman sons sat in the first row behind the table. Walt had wanted to come. Had argued for it, in fact, with surprising stubbornness for a man who'd nearly died in a fire 2 weeks earlier. But his lungs weren't ready for an 8-hour journey, and Pete had told him so with the particular firmness of long affection, and Walt had stayed behind and probably resented it. The lead commissioner was a man named Arthur Greer. She'd researched him before coming, knew he'd been in the territorial office for 11 years, had a reputation for being meticulous and difficult to charm. He called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock exactly, and she noted the exactness with approval. Voss's lawyer presented first. His name was Harlan Foote, and he was good. She'd been prepared for that. He was organized and confident, with the practiced ease of a man who had won most of the rooms he'd walked into. He spent 45 minutes presenting Voss's position, that Gideon Mercer was a struggling rancher looking to blame his financial difficulties on a successful businessman, that the Hartmans were his neighbors and had a natural incentive to support his claims, and that the documentation they claimed to have was either misread, taken out of context, or fabricated by a woman of questionable background who had arrived at the Mercer Ranch under irregular circumstances. He spent about 4 minutes on that last part. He was subtle about it, didn't name the auction directly, just referenced the unusual nature of Miss Hawthorne's arrangement with Mr. Mercer and let the room fill in the rest with whatever version of the rumor had reached them. She kept her face neutral. She'd expected this. She'd written the letter. Commissioner Greer looked at her over his glasses. "Miss Hawthorne, you'll have your opportunity to respond. Mr. Foote, continue." Foote concluded his presentation and sat down with the satisfied expression of a man who'd done a solid morning's work. Voss, beside him, had the air of someone watching a performance he'd already paid for and expected to enjoy. Commissioner Greer said, "Miss Hawthorne." She stood. She didn't look at Voss. She looked at Greer and the 2 commissioners beside him, because they were the only people in this room whose opinion determined anything. "Before I present the documentation," she said, "I want to address Mr. Foote's comments about my background, because he's right that my circumstances are unusual, and I'd rather speak to that directly than leave it to inference." Greer nodded. "Go ahead. 6 weeks ago I was sold at a frontier auction in Mill Haven by my father, who wanted rid of me. Gideon Mercer purchased my guardianship papers and then declined to exercise guardianship, choosing instead to offer me employment as a bookkeeper. I took the job because I needed work and because the terms he offered were fair." She paused. "I say this not to ask for sympathy, but because Mr. Foote has implied that my presence at the Mercer Ranch is improper, and I want the commission to have the accurate version before he has the opportunity to offer the inaccurate one again. My relationship with Gideon Mercer is professional. The work I've done is the work of someone trained in financial record-keeping who was given access to a set of books and read them carefully. The evidence I'm going to present stands or falls on its own merits, independent of who found it. I'd ask the commission to evaluate it accordingly." The room was quiet. Greer looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something down. "Proceed." She opened the folder and began. She'd planned the order carefully, not dramatic first, not the biggest piece of evidence up front where it could be dismissed as exaggeration before the context was established. She built it the way you'd build a structure, foundation first, then walls, then the roof. She started with the pricing discrepancies, numbers, dates, market rates, the pattern across 4 years. She put copies in front of the commissioners and walked them through the calculations without rushing. Greer asked 2 questions. Both of them were good questions that she'd anticipated, and she had the supporting documents ready before he finished asking. She moved to the insurance arrangements, the premium structures, the buried arbitration clauses, what they meant in practice for a rancher trying to make a legitimate claim. She moved to the Cattlemen's Association notice, the one that had arrived 3 days after Dalehurst's visit to the ranch, and explained the composition of the association board and the financial relationships between 3 of its 7 members and Voss Agricultural. She had the association's own published charter and the county business registration records for each of the companies involved. Foote objected twice during this section. Both times, Greer overruled him with the brevity of a man who wasn't going to be managed. She moved to the water rights. She placed the original 1878 survey on the table, Clara's copy, the one from Ernst's father's papers, the oldest record in their combined documentation. She placed the amended 1881 county record beside it. She placed them side by side so the difference was visible without requiring explanation. And then she explained it anyway, precisely, in plain language. These 2 documents describe the same watershed boundary, she said. The original survey, filed in 1878, establishes water access rights for 4 downstream properties, including the Mercer Ranch and the Hartman property. The amended county record, filed in 1881, removes that explicit access language. The practical effect of that removal has been to give Voss agricultural grounds to contest water access for both properties and to delay any renegotiation indefinitely. She placed the amendment document with the signatures in front of Commissioner Greer. The amendment was co-signed by Thomas Alden, who was county registrar at the time. Thomas Alden left the registrar's office in 1882. He currently serves as property manager for Voss Agricultural, a position he has held for the past 3 years. The room was not quiet in the same way it had been before. It was the particular not quiet of people who are absorbing something and trying to find an alternative explanation and not finding one. She heard Voss's voice for the first time. Not loud, controlled, measured. "This is circumstantial." Greer looked at him. "Mr. Voss, you'll address your remarks to your counsel." Foote leaned over and said something quiet to Voss. Voss's expression changed, tightened, very slightly. She placed the final document on the table. "This," she said, "is the co-signature on the 1881 amendment. The county registrar's signature and one additional signature, here," she pointed, "which belongs to the party who filed the amendment request. The name on the filing request is Silas Voss." She let that sit for 3 seconds. Mr. Voss did not merely benefit from the boundary change. He initiated and co-executed it. His name is on the document. The document is a certified copy from the Territorial Records Office, obtained 3 weeks ago through a standard records request. She sat down. The room did the thing rooms do when something irreversible has happened. It seemed to become more still, and then all at once considerably less so. Greer was writing. The second commissioner was leaning over looking at the signature. The third was looking at Voss. Foote was on his feet. "The commission should note that a records request is not a verification of content. The certification seal is from the Territorial Land Office," Abigail said, without standing up. "It's on the bottom right of the document." Foote stopped. Greer looked at the document, looked at the seal, wrote something else down. Clara Hartman presented next. She'd brought her own ledgers, and she walked through the Hartman Ranch's version of the same pattern, the same pricing structure, the same insurance arrangements, the same water rights delays. Clara was not a trained presenter, but she was meticulous, and she was visibly angry in a way that was completely credible. And when Foote tried to question her on a technicality about the date range of one entry, she told him the exact date, the exact amount, and the name of the Voss agricultural representative who'd processed the transaction, from memory, without consulting her notes. Foote did not question her again. It was during the recess, 20 minutes, while the commissioners reviewed the documentation privately, that Silas Voss spoke to her. He came across the room while Foote was occupied with papers, and the commissioners were behind their closed door, and he stopped about 4 feet away. His lawyer's arrangement, the room full of witnesses, he wasn't going to do anything overt. She understood that immediately. This was something else. He looked at her. Close up, she could see something in his face she hadn't expected. Not fury, not desperation, but a kind of cold evaluation, like he was still trying to calculate whether this was recoverable. "You're a smart woman," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only she and Gideon, who was immediately beside her, could hear it. "Smarter than I expected." She didn't respond. "This doesn't have to end here," he said. "There are arrangements that could be—" "Don't." Gideon's voice, flat and quiet. He hadn't moved, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. Voss looked at him, then back at her. She held his gaze and said clearly, "I'll add this conversation to the record." Something moved through Voss's face, the calculation completing itself and arriving at an answer he didn't like. He went back to his table. Gideon said under his breath, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and meant it. The commissioners returned after 22 minutes. Greer sat down and arranged his papers and looked at both tables and said without preamble, "The Commission finds the documentation presented by Miss Hawthorne and Mrs. Hartman to be substantive and consistent with the physical records of this office. The 1881 Watershed Boundary Amendment will be referred to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of potential fraudulent filing. Pending that investigation, all water rights claims predating the amendment are hereby reinstated on a provisional basis for the affected properties." He turned a page. "The pricing and insurance practices documented in the Voss agricultural accounts are referred to the Commerce Board for review. The Cattlemen's Association market restriction against the Mercer Ranch is suspended pending the outcome of that review." Another page. "This commission requests the presence of Thomas Alden for examination by the Territorial Attorney General's office within 30 days. He looked up over his glasses. "Mr. Voss, you are advised that further contact with or pressure applied to any of the complaining parties pending investigation may be treated as interference in a territorial proceeding. Is that understood?" Voss's jaw was tight. "Understood," he said. "Good." Greer gathered his papers. "We're adjourned." It wasn't immediate, the feeling. It moved through her slowly, the way warmth does when you've been cold for a long time and a fire finally gets going. Gradual. Not dramatic, real in a way that dramatic things often aren't. She looked at the documentation still spread across the table and thought about the 5 a.m. lamplight and the county records tied in brown paper and the night she'd found Voss's signature on the amendment and sat very still for a long moment before she let herself understand what it meant. She'd done it. They'd done it. With certified copies and a cover letter and Clara Hartman's memory for dates and Walt's signed statement and Gideon's refusal to stop fighting and Pete holding fence posts steady in the October cold. Pete behind her exhaled, a long, slow release, the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time. Charlie said something that was mostly just noise, the involuntary sound of relief. Ernst Hartman put his arm around his wife's shoulders, and Clara sat straight and didn't cry, but the line of her mouth changed into something that might have been the precursor to crying later, in private, when she felt like it was earned. Voss left without speaking to anyone. His lawyers followed him out in a cluster, already talking quietly. She watched him go and felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter. The specific satisfaction of having been underestimated and having used it. He'd looked at her at the auction and seen a woman her father didn't want. He'd looked at her at the Mercer Ranch and seen a bookkeeper asking inconvenient questions. He'd never looked at her and seen what she actually was. Someone who'd been handed a problem and was very, very good at solving it. That was his mistake. People like Silas Voss made it routinely. The assumption that a person's origins determined their ceiling. That a woman sold for $22 at a frontier auction was not a person who could dismantle your life's work in a Helena hearing room with certified copies and a clear voice. He'd been wrong. The ride back to the ranch 2 days later was quieter than the ride to Helena. Not uncomfortable, just the quiet of people who have used up most of their words and are resting inside the outcome. Charlie fell asleep on his horse somewhere around the 3rd hour, which Pete said was a talent and a hazard in equal measure. The Hartmans had gone their own direction with handshakes and Clara's brief, firm hug for Abigail that said more than Clara probably intended it to. Abigail rode beside Gideon in the wagon and watched the territory move past. The October grass, the mountains, the particular quality of light in the afternoon that she'd been noticing for 2 months now and still hadn't gotten tired of. Somewhere around the 5th hour, he said, "I want to show you something when we get back." "What?" "You'll see." She let it sit. The wagon moved. The mountains kept their distance the way mountains do, always looking close and always being further than you thought. What he showed her when they arrived at the ranch in the early evening was a document on the desk in the study. She picked it up and read it, and then read it again. It was a land transfer, legal, signed, witnessed by Pete Calloway, whose signature she recognized. It transferred 15 acres of the Mercer property's east boundary, the flat, well-watered parcel that ran along the creek's lower fork, into the name of Abigail Ruth Hawthorne. She stood with the document in her hands for a long time. "This is mine," she said. Not a question. She was reading it, making sure she understood it. "Yours," Gideon confirmed. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with the careful expression he wore when he was uncertain how something was going to land. "You earned it. More than earned it. The legal fees alone from what you saved us. That's not why you did this," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." She set the document down on the desk. She thought about the $4 in her skirt pocket on the morning of the auction. She thought about standing on that platform and making a promise to herself, never again, and meaning it fully, completely, with every part of her that had been broken open that morning. She thought about what the promise had cost her to keep, not just the walls she'd built, but what she'd kept out with them, how long she'd stood on the other side of her own life, careful and defended and alone in it. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I owe you something, because—" She stopped, found the words, which were simpler than she'd expected. "Because I want to." Gideon looked at her. "Then stay," he said. "I will." Neither of them made it into something larger than it was. They didn't need to. It was enough, exactly as it was. Silas Voss was formally charged by the Territorial Attorney General 6 weeks later. Thomas Alden entered into cooperation with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. 3 other ranchers in the valley came forward with similar accounts once the proceedings became public. People who'd been too isolated or too uncertain to act alone, but found themselves able to speak into a space that someone else had opened. Connolly, the rancher who'd sold out 4 years ago, was found living in Butte with his wife, working at a mill. The Territorial Commission couldn't give him his land back. It had changed hands twice since Voss acquired it. But the fraud settlement included compensation calculated against the original value of what he'd lost. He received the letter at the mill in November, and his wife later told someone who later told the Hartmans that he'd sat down at his kitchen table and didn't say anything for a very long time. Abigail heard about that and thought about it for days. Dale Hurst left the territory before he could be summoned for examination. Clyde Birch, the auctioneer, whose involvement in Voss's operations turned out to be extensive, but which he documented cooperatively in exchange for immunity, retired from the auction business and was not missed. Her father did not contact her. She hadn't expected him to. That wound was its own kind of work, separate from Voss, separate from the ranch, the slow and private business of understanding that some people are not capable of what you needed them to be, and that their incapacity is not a verdict on your worth. She worked on that quietly, in her own time, without talking about it much, because some things belong to the interior and don't become better for being aired. By spring, the barn was rebuilt, smaller than the original, but solid, with a roofline that she had personally checked for structural integrity before they'd let the builder call it done. The feed account had been renegotiated through a different supplier at fair market rates. The water rights were reinstated, and the creek ran through the north pasture the way it always should have, uncontested. The 15 acres in her name had a fence line she'd helped Pete set in February, driving posts into the frozen ground with the particular grim satisfaction of marking something that was hers. On a morning in April, she walked up the hill behind the east pasture, the one that overlooked the valley, the creek, the rebuilt barn, the house with its smoke rising straight up in the still morning air. She stood up there for a while. She thought about the auction platform, the laughter, the particular sound of it, the way it had gotten through every wall she'd built and left marks she was still, honestly, not finished dealing with. She thought about the $22 in the spare room and the first morning she'd opened those ledgers. She thought about Clara Hartman's handshake and Walt's signature and Pete holding a fence post steady in the cold and Gideon walking into a burning barn for a man who had nothing to offer him in return. She thought about what she'd learned, which was this, that the things that had been done to her, by her father, by the town, by the specific cruelties of a world that measured women by the wrong standards. Those things had happened. They'd left marks. They were real. But they were not, and had never been, the complete story. She was also the person who'd read 6 ledgers and found the thread and followed it until it unraveled something that had taken 20 years to build. She was also the person who'd stood in a hearing room in Helena and presented the truth clearly and without flinching. She was both of those things. She had always been both. It had just taken a while to live somewhere that let her be. The valley below her was beginning to go green with spring, the creek catching the morning light, the mountains still white above the tree line. Smoke from the Hartman place, just visible on the south rise. Somewhere behind her, Charlie was probably already in the south pasture, and Pete would be in the barn, and the ordinary machinery of a working day was running the way it was supposed to run. She stood up there a little longer than she needed to, not because she was waiting for something, not for permission or recognition or the particular validation she'd spent too many years chasing from people who were never going to give it, just because the morning was good and the view was long, and she'd earned the right to stand somewhere and look at it without rushing back to prove anything to anyone. Then she went back down the hill to do the work. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen, to be seen, to be assigned a value by someone with the authority to name it. Abigail Hawthorne had done that. She understood the impulse. She'd lived inside it for 24 years, and she didn't think less of the people who stayed there, because the trap was real, and the walls were high, and it took something specific to find your way out. What it took was not a rescue, not a man with $22 and decent intentions, though that hadn't hurt. What it took was a problem worth solving and the refusal to pretend you couldn't solve it. It took the willingness to be wrong and to keep working anyway. It took understanding that your history is not your ceiling. The woman who'd stood on that auction platform, humiliated, furious, certain she was worth less than the crowd's amusement, had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't been worthless. She'd been underestimated. There's a difference. It took her a while to understand it fully, and she was still honestly working on believing it all the way down. But she understood it. That turned out to be enough to start with.